The centerpiece of the reception table was a tiered cake frosted in ivory, ringed with real garden roses, blush and cream, exactly as my sister had requested. I remember looking at it from across the room and thinking, Nanette made that. She drove 40 minutes to a specialty shop to source the edible gold leaf. She piped the lattice by hand at 4 in the morning because the order came in late. And she was standing in the corner of that banquet hall in a floral dress she'd pressed the night before, holding a glass of sparkling water, trying to take up as little space as possible, while my mother introduced her to the mayor's wife as our housekeeper. The mayor's wife smiled. Then she looked at the cake. Then she looked at Nanette. And she froze. Welcome to Calm Revenge Tales, where the quiet ones always finish the story. If you're new here, this channel is about people who got overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed, and what happened when the record finally got set straight. Subscribe now. You're going to want to be here for this one. I am a structural engineer. I have been licensed in 3 states. My name is Cormac Brielle, and I build things that are meant to hold. I grew up in a house where that wasn't celebrated. My father sold commercial real estate and measured everything in square footage and social adjacency. My mother scheduled the family's emotional life like a public calendar. There were appearances to keep, circles to maintain, and a very precise hierarchy of what mattered and who counted. I left at 18 with a scholarship and a duffel bag. I worked construction summers, tutored physics at night, graduated without debt, and built a small but honest career doing exactly what I said I would. I moved back to the same city 12 years later. Not because I wanted to orbit my parents' world, but because that's where the work was. Nanette Farad had worked for my parents for 22 years. She cleaned their house every Tuesday and Friday, managed their dry cleaning rotation, knew which guest towels were for display and which were for use. She also, by the time I came home, baked most of what appeared on my parents' table when company came. Wedding cakes, birthday torts, Kuan Amen for the holiday parties that my mother claimed to make herself while graciously deflecting compliments. I didn't know the full scope of it at first. What I knew was that when I arrived at my parents' house for the first time after 12 years, it was Nanette who met me at the door, who had prepared a tray of tea sandwiches precisely because she remembered from a letter I'd sent years ago that I didn't eat meat anymore, and who said simply, "You look exactly like yourself." No one else in that house said anything that true to me for the rest of the weekend. My sister Delphine's wedding was the following May. She was marrying a man named Rourke, pleasant enough, who came from a family that owned 2 car dealerships and a lake house. The event was being held at a rented estate 40 miles north of the city, and it was by any measure, a production. Delphine called me in March. She wanted me to come. I was glad. Delphine and I had always been adjacent rather than close, but she had never been unkind, and I wanted to show up for her on a day that mattered. Then she said, "Mom wants to make sure you understand the seating." I waited. She just thinks it would be better if you didn't bring Nanette as a plus one. It's not that she doesn't like Nanette. It's a lot of her colleagues and Rourke's family, and she doesn't want it to be complicated. Complicated, I said. You know how Mom is. I did know how my mother was. My mother was a woman who had once told Nanette, in front of me, to go ahead and eat in the kitchen. It's just family tonight. Nanette had smiled. I had watched Nanette smile in the face of that instruction and carry her plate to the kitchen table and eat alone. And I had said nothing, because I was 19 and I didn't yet know how much silence costs. I told Delphine I'd be there. I told her I'd sit wherever I was put. I didn't mention that I'd already talked to Nanette, who had, without any bitterness I could detect, agreed to bake the wedding cake. A 3-tiered buttercream with hand-piped lace, to be delivered the morning of the reception. She'd been asked by my mother. She'd said yes. She had spent 4 weekends in the 3 months prior doing test batches in her kitchen, which smelled, when I visited, like brown butter and cardamom. "You don't have to do this," I said once, sitting at her kitchen table with a slice of something she was perfecting. She set down her spatula and looked at me. "I know I don't," she said. That was the first of her lines that I kept. She came to the wedding as a guest. My mother had not exactly invited her, but she had not uninvited her either, and I had quietly ensured she had a seat at a table near mine. She wore a dress the color of sage. She pressed it herself. The reception was held in a room with tall arched windows that let in the late afternoon light in long gold panels across the floor. There were perhaps 140 guests. The food was catered. The flowers were over-designed. The cake, Nanette's cake, stood at the center of the dessert table like it had always been there, like it was the only honest thing in the room. My mother spotted Nanette within 20 minutes. I watched it happen from the bar. My mother's posture shifted, just slightly, just the shoulders, and she crossed the room. She brought Nanette into a small group that included a city council member, a developer my father did business with, and the mayor's wife, a woman named Constance Abubakar, who had a reputation for being both sharp and patient. I moved closer. Not quickly, just steadily. By the time I arrived, my mother had already said it. She was mid-sentence, hand lightly on Nanette's arm like they were old friends. And this is Nanette, she's been with our family for years. She's the one who keeps us all from drowning. Light laughter. Then she cleans houses. She's been cleaning ours since before Delphine was born. Nanette's glass was in her hand. She didn't move. The council member nodded and looked away. The developer was already scanning the room for someone more useful. But Constance Abubakar looked at Nanette. Then she looked at the cake. I watched her eyes trace the lattice, the roses, the piping, the specific unmistakable fingerprint of someone who had made something extraordinary by hand. She went very still. I stepped into the circle. That cake was made by Nanette, I said. She's also made every dessert that's appeared at my parents' house for the last decade. She's one of the best pastry artists in this region, and she trained at the Farad Institute in Lyon before she immigrated. My mother's smile held. Cormac. I'm just finishing the introduction, I said. The silence lasted 4 seconds. I counted. My mother said, quietly and with great precision, "This is not the place." And then she said the part that ended things. She turned to Nanette, still smiling, and said, "I think they need help clearing the cocktail tables, if you wouldn't mind." Nanette looked at me. I looked at her. I said, "We're leaving." Constance Abubakar opened her mouth. She almost spoke. I saw it, saw the breath drawn, the lean forward. Then she stopped. She looked down at her glass. We walked out. I chose that. It wasn't a retreat. We went to Nanette's car and she drove, and we found a diner 9 miles up the road. And we ordered eggs and toast at 6:45 in the evening, and Nanette drank her coffee and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," I said. That was the second line I kept. The months after the wedding were quiet ones. My parents did not call immediately. When they did, it was my father, with the tone of someone negotiating a counteroffer. There were 2 calls, then a letter, actual paper, my mother's handwriting, that laid out with remarkable clarity the conditions of family reconciliation. Nanette was not to be elevated. Our relationship, by which they meant my habit of having dinner at Nanette's house, of driving her to medical appointments, of existing in her orbit as though she were a person of equivalent importance, was to be recalibrated. This was, the letter said, for everyone's sake. I filed the letter. Specifically, I placed it in the blue accordion folder I kept for documents worth keeping. It sat there next to my engineering licenses and a lease renewal and something else. A legal-size envelope, cream-colored, with a return address from a firm I didn't recognize, that Nanette had handed me 8 months earlier, and asked me to hold on to. "If something happens," she'd said, which was not the kind of sentence I'd let myself examine too closely. I did not respond to the letter. I did make adjustments. I took on a consulting project in the city to offset the time I was spending driving Nanette to her appointments, which had become more frequent by autumn. Her hands had begun to trouble her. A diagnosis that arrived in clinical language and meant, in plain terms, that the intricate piping work was going to get harder before it got easier. She still baked. She adapted her grip. She made a pot of gumbo in November, her grandmother's recipe, with file powder she'd ordered specially, and she fed me at her kitchen table and told me about her grandmother's house in Port-au-Prince, the window in the back that looked into a mango tree, and how her grandmother had taught her that the way you feed someone tells them what you think they're worth. She used to say, "Don't waste the good ingredients on people who won't taste them," Nanette said. I ate my gumbo. I noted that she had wasted none. Subscribe if you're still here, because the rest of this story is about to arrive, and once the truth lands, it lands fast. Hit that button so it finds you. She declined over winter. Not dramatically, Nanette did nothing dramatically, but the appointments increased, and then there was a hospital stay, brief, and then the hands stopped working the way she needed them to. And then one morning in February I drove her home from the hospital, and she said, on the front steps of her house, with absolute clarity, "I need you to open that envelope when it's time." She passed in March. Quietly. At home. I was there. The cream-colored envelope stayed in the blue accordion folder for exactly 31 days, at which point I received a call from a law firm, the same return address, asking me to come in. The call was courteous. The attorney, a woman named Berenice Okafor, sounded like someone who had made these calls before and understood their weight. I brought the blue accordion folder. I brought the letter from my mother. Berenice Okafor's office had a conference table of dark wood, and a window that looked onto a courtyard where someone had planted lemon trees. She'd arranged for my parents to be present. I didn't know this when I arrived. I walked in and there they were. My mother in a blazer, my father with his hands flat on the table, along with Delphine, who had been told, she later said, only that there was a matter of Nanette's estate. Berenice Okafor opened the file. Nanette Farad had no children. She had outlived her siblings. She had, over the course of her 22 years with my family, documented, carefully, specifically, with receipts and timestamps and a handwritten ledger she'd kept in a fireproof box, every instance in which her labor had been used without credit. Every cake claimed as my mother's. Every dessert attributed to a caterer that she had made herself. Every social event where her work had been the substance and her name had been erased. The ledger ran to 61 pages. She had also, Berenice Okafor explained, built a small amount of wealth. Investments made quietly over years, in a portfolio managed by a woman she'd met at church. The portfolio, as of the date of her death, was valued at $412,000. She had left it entirely to me. My mother's chair scraped back. She stopped. Started again. Her voice was very controlled. She didn't have family. She couldn't have intended. She had one family member of her choosing, Berenice Okafor said, and she did not look up from the file. My father stared at the table. Delphine looked at her hands. My mother performed something that resembled grief. Her eyes filled, her chin lifted. She pressed 2 fingers to her lips, and I recognized it as the same expression she used when a party didn't go as planned. It was the face of someone managing an outcome, not feeling one. There was a secondary clause. Berenice Okafor explained it carefully. Nanette had also left a letter, not the cream-colored one, which was the estate document. This was a separate letter, handwritten, in an envelope marked with my name. Berenice handed it to me across the table. I put it in my jacket pocket. I would read it later, privately, which is what she would have wanted. Then I reached into the blue accordion folder, and I removed my mother's letter. The one about recalibration. I set it on the table. She kept records, I said, because she understood that what was taken from her wasn't going to be returned without documentation. I looked at my mother. The word you used at Delphine's wedding was housekeeper. That word is in this letter too. You were very careful with it. You used it the way you used it at the reception, as a classification. A ceiling. I paused. It's also the word that anchors the ledger's methodology. 61 pages of work done under that classification, without attribution, without compensation for the creative labor specifically. Berenice has advised me on the options. There was the outburst. My mother said with real anger, "You would use a dead woman to." There was the moment of visible shame. Delphine looked at the table, and her shoulders dropped, and she pressed her lips together, and she did not look up for a long time. And then there was the silence. I removed the cream-colored envelope from the folder. I placed it on the table so everyone could see it. Not to threaten, just to let it be present in the room. That envelope had sat in a blue folder for months, unremarkable, patient, the way Nanette had always been, sitting in corners, holding her sparkling water, waiting for the room to see her. I said the thing I said last, and I said it quietly. She told me once that her grandmother taught her not to waste good ingredients on people who won't taste them. I stood up. She spent 22 years feeding this family. Everything she made was worth tasting. The legal process took 7 months. I did not pursue the creative labor claim. Berenice had outlined it, I had considered it, and I declined. I made that offer of restraint not as a gift but as a choice, and I told my parents directly, "This is the boundary of what I will pursue." What I kept was the estate. What I returned to the record was her name. My father sent a response through his own attorney. My mother called once, to say she hoped we could eventually move past this. I said I hoped so too, which was true and also complete. Delphine called on a Tuesday evening. She didn't have an agenda. She said she didn't know about the ledger. She said she'd been thinking about the cake, specifically, about how she'd eaten 3 slices of it at the reception, and told Rourke's mother that the caterer was remarkable, and how she hadn't said Nanette's name because she didn't know, and how not knowing wasn't the same as being innocent. She cried a little. I didn't fill the silence for her. She earned it. She asked if I had the recipe for the kouign-amann. I told her I did. Nanette had written it out for me, by hand, the previous Christmas, in the same careful script she used for the ledger. I offered to share it. Delphine said. She would have wanted that, wouldn't she? It wasn't a question. I didn't answer it like one. My parents are living with the record as it now stands. The estate is mine. The ledger is documented. The investments Nanette made quietly, carefully, without anyone watching, have been put toward a fund I'm establishing for immigrant workers in the food and domestic service industries, because that is what she told me, in the letter I read privately, that she wanted done with some portion of it. I live in a small house now. I have a kitchen with a good window. Every Sunday morning I bake something. I'm not Nanette. My piping is uneven and my laminated dough still tears at the corners. But I am learning from a handwritten recipe card that sits on my counter in a frame I found at a market for $4. The frame is wooden. It's nothing. It's the best thing in my house. Her final line was in the letter. She wrote it at the end after the instructions, after the practical matters, after everything that needed saying was said. She wrote, "You always tasted what I made. I think about that most mornings. I think about what it means to really taste something, to let it land, to let it count, to say the name of the person who made it. That's the thing they couldn't take from her. It was always hers. She passed it on. If someone in your life is doing the quiet, unglamorous, essential work, and you haven't said their name out loud in a while, do it today. Call them. Say it clearly. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment about someone who deserved more credit. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing from people who chose dignity when cruelty would have been easier. I'll see you in the next one.